Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the hosts for inviting me to participate in what promises to be a very interesting discussion. In addition to my role as moderator, I will also be giving a brief presentation whose purpose is to set the stage for my fellow panelists that follow. I'll begin by briefly discussing the constraints that population aging and population decline may place on the developed countries and their capacity to maintain national and global security. And then I'll talk about some of the geopolitical risks that demographic trends in the emerging world, and particularly East Asia, pose. While the entire world is aging, the developed countries are leading the way into humanity's graying future. For most of human history, until well into the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, the elderly comprised only a tiny fraction of the population, never more than 5% in any country. In today's developed world, the elderly comprise roughly 15% of the population. This share is due to rise to 25% by the middle of the century. And this is just the average. In some fast-aging European countries, the elderly share of the population could be reaching 35%, and in Japan, it may be approaching 40%. The most developed countries will not only have aging populations, but stagnating or declining ones. In fact, by the 2020s, the United States will be the only major developed economy that still has a growing workforce and a growing population. By the middle of the century, by 2050, there'll be 25% fewer working-age Italians than there are today, 30% fewer working-age Germans, and 36% fewer working-age Japanese. Now, these trends, population aging and population decline, as I suggested at the beginning, do at least potentially threaten to impose significant constraints on the ability of today's developed alliance to project power and to maintain national and global security. The most obvious constraint, though not necessarily the most important, is the prospect of emerging manpower shortages. Again, with the exception of the United States, the major developed economies will either have stagnating or in some cases, such as Japan's, sharply contracting service age populations. Now, it's often argued, particularly in Japan, but in the United States and elsewhere as well, that manpower isn't really important to security anymore, certainly not as important as it was, that we can substitute military technology for military manpower. To which I would say yes, to a certain extent, perhaps to a large extent, but boots on the ground are important for some missions, particularly for nation building. And in any event, the capacity of developed countries to buy the technology to substitute for manpower will itself be constrained by the rising fiscal burden of expenditures on retirement and healthcare programs. Graying means paying. It means paying more for pensions, more for healthcare, more for long-term care for the frail elderly. On average, projections which I have done suggest that maintaining the current generosity of today's benefit systems would cost roughly an extra 10% of GDP. over the next few decades, on average in the developed world. There are very few, if any, countries, certainly not Japan, and perhaps not even the United States, that can raise an extra 10% of GDP in tax revenue for old age benefits, so benefits will have to be cut. But those cuts are likely to meet resistance from aging electorates who are highly dependent on these government transfer programs. So what does a politician do when faced with a choice between a politically suicidal benefit cut and an economically ruinous tax hike? Well, one of two other things may happen. You may crowd out other government spending, including spending on national defense and foreign assistance, or you may run widening fiscal deficits that undermine economic growth, or you may do both. Certainly that's what the United States is doing. Now, economic growth will be slowing in any event. Economic growth, after all, is the product of two factors, employment growth and productivity growth. And as you can see in this table, which shows the decade-over-decade average annual growth rate in the working age population, there will be a dramatic slowdown in the labor input to economic growth. By the 2020s and 2030s, working age populations in Japan and some fast-aging European countries will be contracting by between 1 and 1.5% per year. Now, certainly higher labor force participation rates, particularly at older ages, could make up, offset some of that economic drag. Higher productivity might also, but the unfortunate fact is that population aging is likely to pull productivity down, not boost it up, because rates of savings and investment will be falling, and also because workforces will be graying. And as painful as this is for me to say personally, productivity peaks somewhere in midlife and then generally declines at older ages. Now, slower growth in the developed world combined with more rapid growth, continued rapid growth in the emerging world, will inexorably lead to a relative economic decline of the developed countries. What this chart, based on projections by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, shows is 100% is the collective GDP of the G20 countries projected out to 2020. And you can see the developed world share declines dramatically from 74 to 42%. The US drops from 34 to 24. Japan disappears essentially, falling from 12 to 4%. The other G7 countries from 27 to 12. Now, population size alone does not confer geopolitical power. But population size and GDP size together are powerful, potent twin engines of national power, of geopolitical stature and national power. A larger economy means more resources to devote to the hard power of national defense and to the semi-hard power of foreign assistance. It also may increase what is often called soft power because one's global business reach, one's leverage with multilaterals, one's clout in the global culture and global media depend to some significant extent on one's economic heft. Now we move beyond the realm of quantifiable, or at least thus far quantified social science. But I do want to raise this somewhat speculative point because I think it's important, and also because it was raised by Senator Webb in the morning session. Will aging societies become more risk-averse? Will they domestically tend to protect current consumption claims, current government benefits at the expense of future-oriented investments? Will they internationally tend to opt for ad hoc settlements rather than decisive confrontations. In other words, as individuals, time horizons tend to shrink, and risk aversion tends to rise as we age. Will that happen to societies as a whole? We don't know the answer to the question, but it's an important question to ask. Let me just, before leaving the developed world, pause for just a moment to point out the obvious, which is that the impact of aging and the degree of constraint on ability to project power varies significantly, or will vary significantly, from country to country. It's likely to be greatest in Japan, which is ground zero for global aging. It will be least in the United States, which is currently the youngest of the major developed economies, as Senator Webb pointed out, and thanks to its relatively high fertility rate and substantial net immigration, will still be the youngest, and by an even wider margin in 2020 or 2030. So perhaps there's some comfort in that, but I would also point out that despite its favorable demographics, the United States labors under a number of significant self-inflicted handicaps that may offset its demographic advantage. These include our low national savings rate, our extraordinarily expensive healthcare system, and a political economy which seems incapable of making realistic trade-offs between competing resource priorities. So the demographics in the United States are certainly sounder long-term, but that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't cause for concern. Now, to turn much more briefly to the emerging world, I guess none of this would matter all that much if the emerging world were moving towards a future of greater peace, prosperity, and stability. And I'll take my remaining couple minutes to give my thoughts, at least, on what demographic trends say about the prospects. There is a view, and a rather prominent one, that in fact demographic trends are pushing the emerging world towards a more stable, more peaceful future. I dubbed this school of thought the demographic peace thesis in a book I wrote called The Graying of the Great Powers. And there are basically two components to it. The first illustrated in the first table. You know, we know that large youth bulges are associated with, my colleague Jack did the pioneering work on that, with social and civil strife and state failure. Well, youth bulges are going to be fading throughout most of the developed world. This should promote social and political stability. The second component to the thesis is the emergence of a demographic dividend. As dependency burdens fall and the share of the population in the working ages rises, this gives a potential big boost to economic growth. I think there's much merit in this thesis, but I'd also just offer a couple of caveats. And the first is that the pace of the transition across the emerging world of the demographic transition is highly uneven. There are parts of the emerging world where the transition is stalled, fertility is not falling in much of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the greater Middle East. If youth bulges are a problem there today, they're going to be a problem in 20 years as well. Meanwhile, you have other parts of the emerging world, particularly in East Asia, that are traversing the entire distance from demographically young and growing to demographically old and declining at a breathtaking pace. China faces a massive age wave that will arrive in full force in the 2020s that potentially undermines the twin pillars of the current regime's legitimacy: rapid economic growth and social stability. Russia's on the cusp of the steepest, what may turn out to be the steepest population implosion of any major power since the plague-ridden Middle Ages. By the 2020s, both countries could stand on the knife edge between social chaos and, in reaction, authoritarian clampdown. I need to conclude. The other caveat I wanted to mention is simply what I call the journeys can be more dangerous than destinations caveat. It is certainly true that development does, in the long run, lead to greater prosperity and stability, but that does not necessarily mean that countries move linearly in that direction. Just think back. We have one example of a complete group of a group of countries that has completed the entire demographic transition. The mostly Western current alliance of developed countries. And the history of their passage through that transition during the 19th and 20th centuries was one of social revolution, and total war. So if demographics pushes towards peace and prosperity, all I'm saying is that we're not out of the woods yet. There are certainly steps that the developed countries can take to mitigate and ameliorate the impact of demographic aging on geopolitical capacity. But these steps, the reforms that are required are every bit as sweeping as the demographic transformation itself. We're talking about a complete overhaul of old age benefit systems, about major tax reform and labor market reform that boosts savings and increases labor force participation, about forging new security alliances with younger and still growing emerging markets that share our basic values. And in fast-aging countries like Japan, we're talking about reversing the demographics themselves through comprehensive pronatal policy and perhaps immigration. Because at a 1.3 fertility rate, there is no long-term solution. The Japanese government itself projects the date there'll be only one Japanese citizen left living. Final note, oddly, I'm perhaps somewhat more optimistic in certain regards about Japan's future as America's future. We must remember that the Japanese have a proven historical capacity for self-renewal and reinvention. During the Meiji Restoration, after World War II, with the creation of Japan Inc., the challenge now lacks the drama, perhaps, but the consequences are every bit as important. So thank you, and let me turn it over to Keisuke-san.
神戸外大の中島圭介でございます。本フォーラムには企画段階から参加させていただいているんですが、このテーマに関心を持っていただいてですね、フォーラムにご参与いただき、それから本日を迎えるにあたってですね、笹川の方からは茶の専務、村田さんをはじめとする事業部の皆さん、それからウィルソンセンターからはロバート・ハスウェイアジア部長、後藤さん、皆さんの多大なるご支援をいただいてきたことにまず感謝申し上げたいと思います。さて、冒頭はドクター・ジャクソンから当パネルのテーマ設定を行うプレゼンをしてくださいましたが、人口高齢化進行によって外交安全保障政策と関連して生じてくるリスクとして、第一に先進国側のストーリーとしてですね、労働力、それも特に経済、外交、軍事の主役たる若い労働力が減少してくる、経済成長の鈍化、財政の悪化などによって国が外交安全保障上の影響力を行使していく上でのキャパシティが減少していく。その一方で対外的にどの程度、それからどのように関与していくのかと国として意思決定していく上で国民世論、選挙民の意思、意欲、ムード、こういったものがリスク回避の方向に向かっていくと、より内向きで断固たる行動を避ける傾向が顕著になってくると、そういったご指摘だったかと思います。 で一方で、新興国側のストーリーなんですけども、2つ目のストーリーですね、デモグラフィック・ピース・ティーシスと、日本語で人口学的平和論とでも訳しておきますけれども、人口高齢化進行は、社会・政治不安の可能性を高めると言われる若者世代の膨張、Youth Bulge という専門語用語が使われておりましたが、これとですね、この収束や成長の追い風になると言われる人口ボーナス、デモグラフィック・ディビデンドですね、を迎えることによって、社会・政治的安定期、それから経済的成長期の到来が予測されるところではありますけれども、ただしそれはあくまでも長期、超長期の発展の方向性、可能性の問題であって、重要なのはその前に中期的にですね、新興国内だけでなく、外交安全保障上のリスクが周辺国にも及ぶ可能性があるというご指摘でした。そしておそらく最も重要なのは、最も問題なのは、この先進国側の制約がピークに達する時期と、それから特にアジア新興国のリスクが高まる時期とが、どうやら2020年代で重なっているという点です。で、彼の言葉を借りれば、The Crisis of the 2020s という言葉を使っておりましたが、2020年代の危機ということでした。こういったことへの警鐘を鳴らしておられました。で、私のプレゼンの中では、このストーリーを日本の現状と今後の見通しと照らし合わせながら解釈いたしまして、3つだけポイントを指摘したいと思います。1つ目のポイントは、日本の技術力、イノベーションへの過度の自信、別の言い方をすれば、こうした力を日本の人口高齢化による経済力、軍事力、国力の低下の救世主のように、安易に期待することへの警告です。人口高齢化が日本にもたらす影響として、人的資源については、主要先進国中、最も出生率が低く、また出生率が 2.1 人の人口置換水準を下回って以降の期間が最も長いと。この2つを合わせまして、労働力の減少率を最も大きく、経済成長の持続、軍事兵力の維持の観点から、日本のマンパワー不足の深刻さについては疑う余地がないでしょう。財政資源については、すでに今日先進国中最大の累積公的債務残高を持ち、今後の公的社会保障、社会福祉費用の増大によるさらなる財政難、金融資本市場におけるクラウドアウトが予測されます。さらに、経済学で消費、貯蓄のライフサイクル仮説が唱えるように、貯蓄が盛んな中高年人口に比べて、すでにある貯蓄を取り崩して生活する高齢者人口が相対的に大きくなっていくことで、今日千数百兆円に上る日本の家計が有する金融資産も徐々に減少傾向に向かうと考えられます。官民双方で資金枯渇に直面する可能性も非常に高いと言えるかと思います。で、こうしておのずと将来の技術革新を頼みの綱とし、またものづくりで培った技術力への自信もあって、日本は高齢化進行で人材資金不足に拍車がかかったとしても、それでも技術革新で補えるんだと、克服できるという希望的観測を持つ傾向が強いように感じております。しかし、技術革新を継続していくこと、そのものにもまた人材資金が必要であるということ、人口減少や経済市場規模の縮小が続けば、技術革新を進める上での規模の経済も損なわれる可能性も高い。さらに、人材面で単に頭数だけの問題ではなく、労働者の高齢化も進む。そういった中で、起業家精神であったりとか、クリエイティビティを持つような個人の減少、新規分野への開発、投資リスクを回避する傾向などが、他の若くダイナミックな国々に比べて顕著になってくるという可能性があると考えられます。要するに、日本で一般的に考えられているよりは、技術革新はそうやすやすとは救世主とはなってくれない。人口高齢化は一般的に想定される以上に人材、資金、技術力、すべての面から日本の経済、外交、軍事力を蝕む可能性があると。これが私の一つ目のポイントです。二つ目のポイントは、アメリカの人口動態の特殊性と日米関係についてです。ドクター・ジャクソンのスライドの中にも先進国の最後の一枚として入っていたものです。まず明白な事実ですが、日米関係は先進国中最も若い国と最も老いた国のパートナーシップであるということです。 アメリカが人口代替率とちょうど同じ出生率 2.1 人を持つ国であるために、2030年代前半にかけてアメリカの高齢化は収束傾向にあります。一方で出生率回復の兆しが見られない日本では、見通せる将来において高齢化進行は止まりません。両国の差は広がるばかりというわけです。そしてこの高齢化進行度の格差が、日米間の外交安全保障上の制約の格差を今後も継続的に拡大していくと考えられます。このことはまず日本が世界的な経済大国、東アジアの地域大国からミドルパワーの国へ徐々に地位を後退させる中で、日本単独では外交安保戦略上何かを諦めて、何かを妥協せざるを得ない局面が増えてくるということを意味します。したがって日本は高齢化進行に起因する制約を把握しつつ、精査しつつ、外交安全保障上の優先性、何を実現したいのか、どこに妥協の余地があるのか、これ以上妥協できないレッドラインはどこにあるのか、こういったものをさまざまな角度から精査する必要があると考えています。次に日米関係の中でこの日本のミドルパワーへの後退をどのように捉えていくのかということです。長期的視点から両国の外交安全保障戦略のすり合わせが必要になってまいります。現在アメリカは長年の対テロ戦争、リーマンショック後の財政支出、道半ばで行き詰まった公的医療制度改革、暗礁に乗り上げたままの財政再建などによって、オバマ政権が進めている、掲げているアジア重視政策が単にレトリックに終わらずに、人的、財政的、政治的資源をどの程度つぎ込んで、具体的なコミットメントが行えるのか、疑問符がつかざるを得ない状況にあります。一方、日本では、安倍政権が強引さを増す中国や挑発を繰り返す北朝鮮などを注視しつつ、特定秘密保護法の制定、集団的自衛権の容認のための憲法解釈変更など、日本の対外的役割を拡大する方向で動いています。このような昨今の変化は、人口動態が指し示す長期的な日本の軌道とは異なるベクトルなわけです。つまり、日本がアジア外交安全保障上、アメリカに対して役割拡大を約束しながら、実際には日本の人口動態的制約がその実行を許さない、履行を許さないと。このために、両国関係に齟齬や機能不全が生じる可能性がある。こういったことについて、このことが私の2つ目のポイントです。最後に3つ目のポイントですが、台頭する、主張を強める、そして今後急速に老いる中国と日米はどう向き合っていくのかということに関してです。ドクター・ジャクソンの2つ目のストーリーで、東アジア新興国における急速な高齢化進行によって、社会政治的安定性、経済的繁栄を損なうリスクが拡大するという指摘がございました。そのスケールや影響力の大きさから最も注視すべきは中国の動向であると考えています。高齢化の波が到来するまでに中国が次の時代の持続的成長エンジンを備えられなければ、急速な成長減速は避けられないでしょう。急速な都市化、工業化、近代化の中で蓄積してきたさまざまな矛盾に高齢化が拍車をかけることで、中国国民の社会政治不満が爆発し、このリアクションとして中国当局が権威主義的色を強めて国内引き締めを行ったとすれば、天安門事件再来のような事態にもなりかねないですし、グローバル経済にも大きな負の普及効果を及ぼすだけでなく、中国当局の強硬な姿勢は対外にも向けられる可能性があるわけです。日米にとってこのような事態を未然に回避するために、中国との関係性づくりを試みることが戦略上得策と考えます。もう一つの見方は、日本がミドルパワーになる過程で、2つ目のポイントで指摘した日米間の齟齬や機能不全が生じないようにするためには、日本が後退もしくは縮小した部分の役割を新たなパートナーを採用することで補うというものです。米中、日中の間には、さまざまな外交安保上の問題が山積しており、台頭する、主張を強める中国と付き合っていく上で、すでに米国が進めているオーストラリアや東南アジア諸国との外交安保政策上の連携が一般的に言われております。もちろんこのことの重要性や妥当性は否定はいたしませんが、繰り返しになりますが、老いる中国と 日米が正面から向き合おうとする試みが必要と考えています。つまり、中国の人口動態リスクとその国内外へのインプリケーションについて、米中日などで多国間で危機意識を共有し、問題対処で連携を強めるために対話し、具体的なアクションにつなげるための枠組みづくりを提唱します。以上、私からは日本の技術進歩への警告、日米関係の齟齬や機能不全への警告、そして日米が老いる中国と高齢化対策で対話、協調する枠組みづくりの提唱の3点を指摘しました。詳細やカバーできていない点については、後ほどのディスカッションや Q&A の中で触れさせていただきたいと思います。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
It's a pleasure to be here. I particularly want to thank the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for making this possible, and to the Woodrow Wilson Foundation for working together to create this special event. Peace, unfortunately, is not simply the absence of conflict. Peace is the result of a continued effort to keep the forces of chaos and conflict at bay. And it's the joint effort to create and maintain peace that Senator Webb talked about this morning, and that I think is the essential goal of the U.S.-Japanese relationship that we're here to discuss. My colleagues, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Kazuki, have talked about the global situation. I will talk a bit about that, but we'll focus a bit more on Japan. Now, the world as a whole is changing. Dr. Jackson mentioned that Japan has reinvented itself twice. Toward the end of the 19th century, the Meiji oligarchs restructured Japan's economy and political system. And at the end of World War II, Japan again restructured its economy and its political system. The day is now at hand when it may require another large-scale reconstruction of the basis for Japan's economy and even its political system in order to keep Japan competitive and significant in Asia and the world. There will be aging, unprecedented aging, and the loss of young workers and consumers in rich countries, as we've been told. It has not been mentioned, but urbanization will be a major part of future economic change, and particularly urbanization in poorer countries. The global middle class, which is largely urban, is growing most rapidly in the poor and middle income areas of South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. China, which has led the world in economic growth for the last 30 years, is going to enter a slowdown and a demographic crisis of its own. This poses a number of difficult issues for China, but also could pose a threat for international security, depending on how China reacts to its own internal crisis. And Japan is in some ways feeling the brunt of these changes more than any other country. Its markets for exports will be affected by the growth of the global middle class as the world's largest, fastest growing consumer markets. Aging is hitting Japan first and harder than other countries. And Japan is feeling the problems of continued urban growth in the context of a declining population that is emptying out its countryside and rural prefectures. And I'll skip quickly to what is happening in Japan. These projections of Japan's population by age group show that at least over the next 10 to 20 years, there will only be a modest decline in the overall population of Japan. The overall population reductions start to accelerate after 2030. But the decline in the labor force, that's the large green segment of this graph, ages 25 to 59, that decline is already rapid. And indeed, over the next 30 years, the decline in the working age population will be the biggest component of Japan's population change. Meanwhile, the over 60 and over 80 populations will grow. So total population change will be modest, but that conceals what's happening at different age groups. Working age groups will be shrinking, and the elderly groups will be growing. In fact, to understand what is happening in Japan, one really has to look at different age groups. And here I have plotted the young critical age group entering the labor force, those aged 15 to 24, and those that are the old, the over 80 population. Now, the over 80 population in Japan is exceptionally healthy by global standards, but it is growing with extraordinary speed. And while we are unusual in Japan in seeing a large number of people in their late 70s and even early 80s in the labor force and in positions of leadership and responsibility, this is still, as you can see for the years 2000 and 2010, a small group. Even today in Japan, the number of young people aged 15 to 24 is slightly larger than the population age 80. But by around 2020, these segments of the population will cross, and after 2020, Japan will become a society in which the number of people who are quite old, over age 80, starts to rapidly exceed the number who are quite young. Now, most societies throughout history have relied on the population aged 15 to 24 to be the source of productivity gains. It's that group of people that enters the labor force with new education, new tastes, new abilities. As they enter the labor force and acquire work experience, their productivity tends to grow very rapidly. So when you have lots of young people entering the labor force bringing new skills, and as their work experience and their ability and hence their productivity grows over their 20s, 30s, and 40s, the economy benefits from this demographic bonus. On the other hand, for populations aged 80 plus, at least historically, that population is not acquiring new skills, that population is not increasing its productivity over time, and quite the reverse, that population tends to tap into savings and draw more resources out of society simply in order to support itself. In a sense, this graph shows a future generational conflict in the making. Will the population of the elderly use their political clout to continue to draw resources to themselves at a time of productivity, stagnation, or decline? If so, Japan's overall economy will be severely constrained. What will be of great importance in the future for Japan is to boost productivity to make up for the declining population and declining workforce. But boosting productivity requires heavy investment in the skills, work experience, and productivity of the young. And there is a very strong risk that with the number of young people shrinking, the number of older people growing, that society will be pulled away from making those investments. As my colleagues have pointed out, pension and health support relies on promises that have been made to the elderly. So far in this century, what we have seen in Japan is that roughly every 25 years, the number of working age people to support retired people declines by about half. So from 1960 to 1985, the ratio fell from about 16 to 8. From 1985 to 2010, it fell from about 8 to about 4, and is projected over the next 25 years to fall from about 4 to 2. Now, while it looks like most of the decline has already occurred, and you may say, all right, we've gotten through the worst of it. In fact, what is revealed here is a trajectory of exponential change. That is, the burdens on the younger generation are doubling every 25 years. And the strange thing about exponential doubling means that you run out of time very quickly. If you imagine a pond with water lilies and the number of water lilies doubles every year, it may take several years to fill half the pond with water lilies, but if they are doubling every year, it only takes 1 year to go from a situation where half of the pond is clear to where the pond is completely lost. There's no surface left to the water lilies as they exponentially grow. And the squeeze on resources is similar. For the first 40 or 50 years, Japan has been able to accommodate an aging population by tax adjustments and by borrowing. But as has been said, borrowing has pushed Japan's public debt up over 200% of GDP and leaves the question of, at that point, how do you cope with the next doubling of burden on the young to support the growing elderly population? Let me now move away from Japan to what's happening in East Asia as a whole. As Japan has to cope with this large volume of increased aging population, the burden of pension and health care, it is also facing a situation in which East Asia is transforming rapidly around it. In 1960, Japan, shown here as the shadowed blue bar, Japan was still the largest country by population in East Asia, much larger than the Philippines, Myanmar, Thailand. Only Indonesia was close, and Indonesia was a much, much poorer country. Japan, from 1960 to 1980, was a booming country and became the world's second largest economy. By 2000, Japan's relative position had declined somewhat, but it was still, except for Indonesia, the largest country, and even Indonesia was only about twice as large in population, maybe not even that much, maybe 50% larger in population, and again, much poorer. But over the next 40 years, the other countries in East Asia look to be growing very rapidly. The Philippines will probably pass Japan in population. Vietnam will come very close to catching up to Japan in population. And even Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia, though still smaller, the three of them together will be as large as all of Japan. So Japan's position demographically is declining quickly relative to its near neighbors. And indeed, by the end of the century, Japan will look like a relatively unexceptional country, a very major change in its demographic position within the region. And as was already pointed out, if rates of economic growth remain as they are, Japan's percentage of GDP will shrink to an almost insignificant 4% or so by the second half of this century. So if things continue as they are going today, Japan will find itself in a much weaker position relative to neighboring countries. The one exception, however, is China, because China is about to undergo its own demographic decline, kind of the long-term effect of the one-child policy, which sharply constricted the number of young people after 1980. They are now entering childbearing years. And so we have already started to see in just the last few years the beginning of a decline in China's labor force. This is a decline that is going to accelerate dramatically after 2020. If you look closely at this graph, you'll see, looking at the blue line, that between 2010 and 2020, the decline in China's labor force is visible but still small. After about 2020, maybe toward 2030, the decline in China's labor force becomes very dramatic and accelerates sharply all the way out to 2060. The leadership of China is aware of this. They may be looking at the next 10 to 15 years as their window of opportunity to project Chinese power before their labor force and hence their military and other capacities start to decline very dramatically. At the same time, China will also face a very rapid increase in its population over age 60. This scissors of declining labor force and rising aged population means that after 2020, China's number one concern will be what Japan faces today, but perhaps even in a more extreme case, China being a poorer country and having this burden of declining workforce and rapid aging with relatively little room to spare. So again, the next 10 to 20 years may be the time that Chinese leadership decides to be more aggressive. Now, what are the options for Japan to change its future, to strengthen itself economically and demographically? One simple thing that can be done is to raise the participation of women in Japan's labor force. Japan surprisingly lags all the other developed countries in the percent of adult women who are actively employed. Simply increasing the female workforce could raise Japan's GDP by as much as 12%. That is 10 years worth of economic growth at this point. But equalizing male and female labor force engagement would be one very easy resource. More difficult, but equally important, is to encourage women in the labor force to be both active and to have families. This is a contradiction, the choice between getting married and moving home to raise a family, or getting married and remaining in the labor force. That is a big burden for women in Japan, also in Korea, in China. This is a problem, however, that has been solved to some degree in France, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, the United States. In these countries, there are a number of support mechanisms to provide child care, assistance to women, guarantees of their place in their companies and in the workforce if they take a leave for children. It is a difficult balance to achieve, but a number of countries have done it, and by doing so, that is, by making it easy for women to combine careers and childbearing, they have produced levels of fertility at around 1.9 to 2, much higher than you find in most of East Asia. It requires a fair bit of commitment of resources, on-site nurseries, support for working women, career allowances. It requires a change in the roles of men and women that can be quite jarring. But again, it's a time for reinvention of traditional life in Japan if Japan is going to have a better future. Another very socially difficult issue is immigration. As was just mentioned, hope was that technology would solve the labor force problems, but in order to have rapid technical growth, one needs rapid productivity growth. It's hard to have rapid productivity growth and innovation with a rapidly shrinking number of young people in society. You also don't want to be moving young people into low productivity tasks like care for the elderly, construction. What you want is to have more science and high skill workers, and immigration can help fill that gap. Is immigration difficult? Yes. The United States, which does it perhaps better than any other country, Canada and Australia as well, will tell you it is difficult to provide properly for immigrant populations. But the experience of Australia, the United States, and Canada also says if you want to continue to have a dynamic, rapidly growing economy and a strong population, immigration is a powerful tool. Japan must innovate in care for the elderly and in pioneering elderly lifestyles, but that's an opportunity as well as a challenge because the aged population is growing everywhere in the world. So the opportunity is there for Japan to become a world leader in care for the elderly, making it more efficient, more effective, and that would create an opportunity for Japan's technology to become a leader in a fast-growing global market. In all of these regards, it's important for Japan to be global, to remain engaged with the best global technology, to grow into fast-growing global markets. And in Japan, it often seems that people see a contradiction between becoming more global and remaining truly Japanese. You see this in the smaller number of students who leave Japan for higher education, a smaller number now than even 20 years ago. You see it in the lesser ability of Japanese elites to be comfortable in English compared to their counterparts in Taiwan or other parts of Asia. And this is something that really needs to be reversed. It is possible to be both more global and to retain the character of Japanese society and culture. What Japan has always done, in fact, I would argue what Japan has done better than most other societies, is to borrow the best practices and the best ideas from other societies. The suits we're all wearing here today came in the 19th century from European models, but borrowing from abroad has never made Japan weaker. It has usually been the key to Japan's success. Borrowing the best products and ideas, adding Japanese insight, and integrating them into Japanese culture. Finally, it will also be extremely important for Japan to deepen its partnerships with its neighbors. I've already pointed out that the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand will be growing demographically very rapidly while Japan is not. Much of the economic growth in the region will be in these countries, but also in Africa and the Middle East. Japan, if it's going to tap into those global sources of growth, will have to be global and engaged. Security will also depend to an increasing degree on external support. There's really no alternative given that Japan's economy and population will be shrinking relative to its neighbors. But that external support can come partially from NATO and Australia and New Zealand. But it's also important for Japan to deepen its security and strengthen its relationships with other countries in Asia. After all, Japan was of great value to the United States, partly because its sheer size and economic power made it the dominant force in the Western Pacific, other than China. In the future, Japan's economic and demographic weight will be smaller, and part of Japan's value will be the degree to which it can become a leader, the center of broader integration and relationships with other countries in East Asia. In a sense, Japan's soft power, its ability to project a model of success, both economically and politically, its ability to be a model for the further development of other countries in the region, will be a much bigger element than its simple military strength in becoming part of alliances to keep a balance of harmony and peace in the broader region. Thank you very much.
こんにちは。日本総研の大泉です。今日はこのような場で、発言できますこと大変光栄に思います。主催者の皆様には心よりお礼申し上げます。私に与えられたテーマは、東アジアにおける人口動態の社会経済への影響ということであります。私からのメッセージは、経済面では貿易、投資を通じた経済統合で、アジアが一体化し、アジアの世紀を迎えるという見方がありますが、未来を経済面だけから見ていると見余ることになるかもしれませんというものです。人口動態から見ますと、アジアは決して統合ではなく、分断のリスクを抱えているということが、今日の私の報告の本幹であります。私はこの10年、少子高齢化という時間軸を重視した人口動態の観点と、若年層の大量移動に伴うメガ都市の発展という地理的な人口動態の観点からアジアの将来を考えてきました。その2つを合わせますと、アジアの将来は決して明るいものではなく、むしろ準備を怠ると、経済成長を失速させ、新しい政治的課題を抱え込むことになるというものであります。ここに示しましたように、世界人口は21世紀中に世界中では増えるわけですが、アジアでは2030年代半ばに減少に向かいます。これは出生率の低下の影響を受けたものであります。すみません。ちょっとスライドと合いませんが。あります。日本だけではなく、韓国、台湾、香港、シンガポールでも出生率は低下する傾向にあります。また、中国やタイも 1.6 と いう水準になっています。その他のアジア諸国は2を超えるものの、出生率は急速に低下する傾向があります。その結果、アジアでは高齢化が急速に進みます。高齢化の度合いを、高齢化率が 7% から 14% に移行した期間を見ますと、日本は24年しか要していません。右に示した欧州の国と比べると、いかに早く高齢化が進展したかということがわかるかと思います。しかし、アジアの国のほとんどが日本と同じスピードで高齢化が進むことになるのです。高齢化の加速は、人口の塊、ベビーブーマー世代が高齢化することを原因とします。この図表からも明らかなとおり、中国とタイの人口ピラミッドでは、中高年に人口の塊があることがわかります。まだ人口の塊は生産年齢人口の中にありますので、経済はこれらの活力を使って成長することができます。いわゆる人口ボーナスです。しかし、人口ボーナスはそう長く続きません。生産年齢人口の比率が低下する時点を人口ボーナスの効果が失われる時点と見ますと、日本は1990年代に、2000年代に入って韓国や台湾、香港、シンガポール、そして中国、タイでも人口ボーナスの効果が薄れてきます。中国やタイでは所得水準が低いままで人口ボーナスの効果が薄れるということになります。ただし問題はもう少し複雑です。経済のこの図表のこの人口ピラミッドを見ていただきますと、都市と農村では大きく人口のピラミッドが変わっているということがわかるかと思います。経済成長とグローバルの進展の中で、恩恵を最大に享受しているのは、実は高学歴であり、インターネット世代である若年層です。そして学歴がそれほど高くなく、インターネットとは少し距離のある中高年が実は農村にとどまっているということです。上海やバンコク、そのようなメガ都市は、この高学歴インターネット世代である若年層を引きつけることで急成長しています。その結果、地域間で人口構成が大きく異なっています。若年層が農村から都市に向かい、地方は成長を担い手に欠く状態になっています。つまり、極端な表現をすれば、若者中心のメガ都市と高齢者主体の地方農村にアジアは分断されつつあるということです。これが地域間所得の拡大に寄与しているものと考えています。アジアでは着実に少子高齢化が進んでいるのにもかかわらず、私たちは訪れるメガ都市の景観が若々しいことを見ています。ただ、これはアジアの一面に過ぎません。実際には地方農村には多くの高齢者がとどまったままであり、今後、中高年の加齢に伴い、高齢化の度合いが加速することは間違いありません。中国において高齢化が進んでいるのは、実は出生率の一番低い上海ではなく、広東省に出稼ぎが最も多い重慶市であります。日本は、我が国は高齢化が最も進んだ国です。だから私たちはアジアの高齢化に生かせる経験や知識を持っているという自信があります。私もそう思っていました。しかし実際は私たちの経験の多くは所得水準の高い都市部では高齢化に関わるものであり、所得水準の低い農村で深刻化する高齢化には実はあまり役に立たないんです。アジアで起こる高齢化はおそらく日本よりも衝撃が大きいものとなります。私たちはアジアのメガ都市の繁栄があまりにも眩しすぎて地方で起こっていることを見倒すことができません。実はこの点は現地政府やメガ都市の住民も同じです。現地にはメガ都市の繁栄がやがて地方農村まで及ぶのだと楽観視している人が多いのです。そうはいきません。確かに20世紀ならばメガ都市の繁栄は時間とともに地方農村に波及したでしょう。しかしグローバル化が進む21世紀はそのようなメカニズムはほとんど機能しないと考えられます。なぜならメガ都市はブラックホールのように国内から優秀な若者と資本を一方的に引き寄せ、さらには
メガ都市から優秀な人材と資本をより所得の高い地域に解き放っているからです。今やメガ都市と経済関係が深いのは、実は国内の地方、農村ではなくて、他の国のメガ都市だということです。21世紀において、アジアで統合に向かっているのは、実はメガ都市であって、国ではありません。このような優秀な人材や資本が地方、農村に戻るということは期待薄です。加えて、中高年以上のは都市に出て、職を見つけることも困難です。適切な対策を放置すれば、怠れば、アジア諸国は国内が分断の危機に瀕するかもしれない。これが私の主張であります。実は、新興国というのは、未来を約束された国というような響きを持っていますが、実は先進国的なメガ都市と途上国のままの地方農村が併存するという分断の国ということも言えるわけです。このことに現地政府の気づきが遅れれば、分断の程度は広がり、その修復が難しくなるのです。しかし、気がついたとしても、その対処は容易なものではないでしょう。例えば、このような格差是正のためには、社会保障やインフラ整備などの巨額な財政資金を必要とします。その資金を賄うのはメガ都市なのです。しかし、メガ都市の規模は、それを賄うのには小さすぎるのです。例えば、中国のメガ都市の人口は全部足し上げても3億人程度です。それが10億人の生活を賄うというのは、やはり難しいことと考えられます。また、メガ都市の競争力強化には、税率の引き下げが常套手段になりつつ、今日では、メガ都市の資金を地方農村に回すのは、なかなか難しいことであります。しかし、高齢化を放置するわけにいきません。アジアの多くの新興国では、地方農村に人口が多く、そのため政策は支持基盤の確保のため、地方農村へのばらまきの色合いを強めます。それが財政を拡大させますが、それを負担するのも、やはり都市の富裕層であり、都市住民です。その調整に失敗すれば、市民の対立という新しい火種になります。近年のタイの政局不安は、それを示したものと考えます。アジア諸国の持続的な成長の課題について、中所得国の罠という言葉が注目を集めています。今日は時間がございませんので、詳しくは説明しませんが、技術革新や産業構造の転換を怠ると、高所得国になれないという経済面の問題です。しかし、私はそれを実現するのに必要な社会の安定性の維持、すなわち、今日お話ししました社会の分断を回避する方が重要だと思えてなりません。これまでのアジアの繁栄は、安定的な政治社会を前提にしてきたということを私たちは忘れてはならないと思うのであります。私は経済面の中所得国の罠と区別するために、これを中所得国の崖というふうに呼んでいます。そして経済面でいう中所得の罠より、ずっと陥りやすい罠であり、その被害は大きいと考えているからであります。最後に、高齢化がまだ先であるインドネシア、フィリピンについて少し述べておきたいと思います。この両国の人口ピラミッドは裾野が広く、しばらくは人口ボーナスの効果を享受できる状況にあります。しかし、人口ボーナスの効果は自然発生的に享受できるものではありません。多く存在する若年人口の雇用が確保できなければならないわけです。もしそれができなければ、不安を高める可能性があります。先に述べましたように、アジアにおける若年層は比較的高学歴であり、インターネット世代です。都市に住む若年層の不安は、Facebook や Twitter などを通じて大規模集会に発展しやすいことは、アラブの春や、やはりタイの政局不安で示されたことであります。このように、人口動態から見ますと、アジアの将来はそれほど楽観できないというのが私の主張であります。詳しい話はディスカッションの中で対応したいというふうに思います。ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you, gentlemen. We're now going to continue the conversation among the panel members for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes before opening up the session to questions from the audience. Let me begin by sort of reversing the order of my own presentation, where I started with the weakening of the developed world and then talked about possible geopolitical risks in the emerging world, particularly in East Asia. Let's start with the emerging risks. I'd like to hear a little bit more from each of the panelists who cares to comment on geopolitical risk in China. And the way I put it in my own presentation was that by the 2020s, China may stand on a knife edge between social chaos on the one hand or authoritarian clampdown on the other. Is that proposition correct? And if so, which way is China likely to fall? And let me put you on the spot, Jack, if you could sort of draw out a little bit your comment on how China may be taking advantage of its demographic window of opportunity to assert itself geopolitically.
Well, for the last 20 years, China has really enjoyed the benefits of the best of all possible worlds for economic growth. It had a fast-growing labor force. The labor force was disciplined and living in a stable society, but relatively uneducated at the beginning of the 1980s, and then went through a rapid increase in education in the next few decades. So, and let me also add that China had been unusually low in its rate of urbanization in the early 1980s, and therefore had a great deal of room to expand its cities, which also raises productivity. So for the last 30 years, China could combine a fast-growing labor force, rapid urbanization, big increases in the early 1980s, and therefore had a great deal of room to expand its cities, which also raises productivity. So for the last 30 years, China could combine a fast-growing labor force, rapid urbanization, big increases in the skills of its workers, and all of that contributed to sustaining double-digit growth for a remarkable period. But because those motors are now going to be much weaker in the future, China is going to have to look for other ways to grow. It is currently trying to shift itself from dependence on exports and government investment toward consumption, but it's a slow and difficult process. Incomes in China are still relatively low, and a great deal of manufacturing is still geared toward producing products for the export market. Now, during this period of rapid growth, China was able to build up great supplies of capital, which it is now using to invest heavily to expand its military, more technologically sophisticated forces. So from the point of view of China, in terms of their capabilities, their wealth, their income, their military budget, these are wonderful, wonderful times, but they are limited. The future holds greater stresses on its economic growth, greater stresses on capital accounts, and so this is the time if China is going to use or leverage its position for leadership to do so. In addition, because China is going to face greater conflicts in the future, very likely, between urban and rural populations, between young and old, Chinese leaders are focused on trying to build support for the Communist Party through the use of nationalism. There's a very strong campaign to stress the need to rectify past humiliations. This is feeding conflicts with Japan feeding kind of old historical wounds. The Chinese leadership, instead of trying to move beyond these, is playing them up. All of these factors make China, I think, a more difficult and dangerous country in the region than it had been for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, whether China will suffer an internal collapse of some kind, I still see that as not very likely. China's leadership is acutely aware of the risks of internal disorder. It has taken steps to move from a simple-minded repressive approach to a much more sophisticated strategy of responding to protest with non-lethal force, compromise, sacrificing lower-level officials if need be, and trying to manage expectations. So unless there are some unforeseen divisions within the party leadership, unless there's a dramatic economic crisis that a hard landing might produce, if we avoid those things, I think China will hold itself together internally, but it will certainly be aggressive externally because of its awareness of the changing conditions.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Oizumi, would you like to add your thoughts on the question?
はい、私は一人っ子政策のおかげで中国は高成長できたなとまず認識しています。一人っ子政策の結果として生産年齢人口が 70% を超えるというような国は中国以外に存在しません。その結果30年にわたって 10% 以上の成長をしてきたわけです。でその代償としてこれから高齢化が中国では加速的に起こるということです。で中国は今何を考えているかというと、労働力が減少することに対して生産性を上げようと。どう生産性を上げるのか、イノベーションもあります。特にですね、最近で今年から都市化を進めることで生産性を上げるというようなことを模索し始めました。これは都市に出てきた出稼ぎ労働者に対しても都市戸籍を与えるというものであります。これは一見画期的なものでありますが、実は社会不安のリスクを大きく抱えているというふうに私は思っています。つまり都市に出稼ぎが出てきた人に全てに社会保障が付与される都市戸籍がもらえるとするならば、より多くの人が都市に移住してきます。そしてその移住を強制的に中国が行うとすれば、中国の都市化率は急速に上昇するわけです。都市化が上昇すれば経済成長が実現するわけではありません。逆です。経済成長が実現する過程で都市化が進むのです。経済成長なしに都市化を進めるということになりますと、多くの労働者を都市が抱えるということになります。農村から中高年者が強制移住として都市にもし移住した場合、その雇用は確保できるのでしょうか。そしてその人たちに社会保障制度をどのような形で配分するのでしょうか。今例えば上海の人口は2000万です。上海戸籍を持っている人は1200万人にしすぎません。あとの800万人を1200万人が支えないといけないということになるわけです。これからもっと都市化が加速するとどうなるでしょうか。これまでアジアの所得格差というのは都市と農村にある意味地理的に分断された形で格差が広がってきました。ところが今回の都市化が進めば、都市政策が進めば、都市の中に大きな格差が生まれるということです。これは南米化あるいはブラジル化というような形で私は最近呼んでいるんですが、都市の中に大きな所得格差を抱えてしまうという新しい問題を持つわけです。中国は一人っ子政策ということで人口動態に対して、偉大なる挑戦をしたわけです。今もう2つ目のその挑戦として都市化を強制的に進めるということを今計画しているわけです。その結果が良くなるのか悪くなるのか分かりませんが、社会リスクをかなり大きな部分で抱えているということをここでは強調しておきたいと思います。
Very good, thank you. Keisuke, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, 高齢化のトレンドを中国で見ましたら、2020年代半ば頃から急速に加速するわけですね。このあたりを見ますと、ドクター・ジャクソンの言葉にあった2020年代の危機ですね、これが、こういった時期が特に後半にかけてですね、危険地帯であると、危険な時代であるということは間違いないと思います。ということは今2014年ですので、残り5年から10年ぐらいの準備期間を残しているというわけなんですけども、この時代をどういう形で中国が準備期間として積極的に使うのかということが、2020年代の後半をどう迎えられるかということと大きく関わってくるんだと思います。で、私とドクター・ジャクソンで何度か中国当局の方へ政策提言のパッケージを持っていったりしたこともあるわけですけども、その時のイメージとして、ちょっと単直化したようなお話をさせていただくと、まずは中国の問題として当局が頑張ってもらわなきゃいけないことたくさんあるわけですけども、まだその中国の当局のさまざまな財政的なあらゆる力を考えると、高齢化の例えばインパクトが100あるとして、それを全て政府が賄う形で解決するというのは非常にハードルが高いと。そうであれば時間の制約もあるために、比較的シンプルな控えめな制度でもって100あるうちの50ぐらいの高齢化のインパクトは政府が責任を持って解消していただきたいと。で、ただ残りの50をほっとくわけにいきませんので、そこは中国の中の民をもう少し並行して育てるような、促進するような政策を同時にやっていただきたいということで、ただじゃあ中国の民はそれほどの力が今備わっているのかということになると、まだここにも心もとない要素があるわけです。そうすると50プラス残り10なのか20なのかと上に足されるわけですけども、まだ20、30の高齢化のインパクトは残っていると。ここのところへ海外の我々周辺国が協力することによって提供できるベネフィットがあるわけです。で、ただ大泉さんが指摘されてましたように、我々が提供できるものというのはどちらかというと、都市部の所得が高い地域の高齢化に対処できるものだということで、どれほど我々が持ち込んだものが中国の農村部の方へ向けてまで浸透して広く中国全土の高齢化問題を解決できるのかと。要するに50プラス25プラス最後20なのか25なのか、これで100解決できるのかというところになると、ちょっとまだそこにリスクがあるんだと思います。で、最後残された部分のところがどれほど深刻に発展するのかというところが、最後残されたベストシナリオを考えた上でも最後の最後に残されるというふうに考えております。
Thank you, Keisuke. Well, there seems to be some consensus among the panel that the neighborhood in Northeast Asia will remain a potentially dangerous one, perhaps even an increasingly dangerous one. There also seems to be some consensus among the panelists that demographic aging will indeed weaken the capacity of the United States, of Japan, of other developed countries to project power in the future. I'm wondering if any of my colleagues have a thought they'd like to share on the other issue, which is, leave capacity aside, how does aging affect, or how might it affect social mood? How might it affect not the capacity, but the willingness of societies to shoulder a security burden, to intervene abroad, to look beyond their borders, to look beyond this year to the future? Where should we begin? Shall we begin with Dr. Oizumi this time?
はい、その答えが明確なものならば、私はノーベル平和賞をもらえるんじゃないかなと思うんですが、大変難しいことです。ただこの高齢化の研究をしていて一つ思うのは、高齢化の定義というものを我々はもう一度見直す必要があるということです。で、高齢化の定義、65歳以上を高齢化と決めたのは1970年代に国連がそう定義しました。その時点の世界のおそらく先進国の平均寿命が65歳だったということです。今日本の平均寿命は80歳です。 まだまだ60歳、70歳で働ける方はたくさんおいでになられるというふうに思います。となると、我々は高齢化問題にまず考える上で、高齢者とは誰のことなのか、高齢化とはどういうことなのかということを考える必要があるかと思います。すいません、いい答えになってませんが私はコメントは
午前中の基調講演でもウェブ議員がこの問題について触れていらして、私もすぐにメモしてですね、彼の試験としては高齢者というのはより経験もあって、でその経験の中には政府が提供するサービスへの価値を高く評価するという考えも含まれていて、ということは対外的な安全保障国際外交なんかの面での政府の活動にもより積極的なサポートをするんではないのかというのが、ウェブ議員のご指摘だったんですが、それにどう答えようかと、先ほどランチの際にもこの話題でこのテーブルの面々は持ちきりだったんですが、その高齢化が進行していく中でのこういった問題に対する世論のムードというのは、選挙民国民の中でよりそういった意思決定をする際の判断するポイントと言っていいのかどうか分かりませんが、それが暮らしの近いところへ寄ってくる時代なんだというふうに私は理解してるんですよね。英語でガンズ&バタルスということでトレードオフというかいうことで言われるんだと思うんですが、要するに総論ではおそらく高齢者の方々も支持されるんだと思います。そういったことが必要な時代だねと、日本もそういったものに積極的に参加する必要があるねという意味では総論では支持です。ただじゃあ具体策に入ろうというときに、では予算がもう制約がありますと、あなたの年金と医療と介護とそれから外交のそれから安全保障のこういったオプションがある中で、それでもあなた外交だったり軍事だったりそちらの方へ予算を回してでも支持されますかと言ったときに、やはり自分の生活、自分の痛みを伴うところで消極的にならざるを得ないと、そういうムードが高まるを得ないというふうに考えています。それからもう一つ、自分の近いところへ意思決定のポイントが近づいてくる時代というのは、結局今後日本がですね、セルフディフェンスフォースですね、海外へ送るという話になったときに、家族一族の中で唯一の男の子とか唯一の女の子が、そういった活動に参加せざるを得ないと、そういう子たちを海外へ送るんだという意思決定になるわけです。でその時にやはり、周りの子どもたち、若い子どもたちを見てかわいそうだというふうな消極的な、より内向き的な意思決定のムードが生まれてくるということも避けられないんではなかろうかというふうに感じています。
I think if there is a visible crisis, whether it's a humanitarian emergency or a security conflict that people see as a threat, they'll be willing to make the immediate sacrifice, sending their children, raising taxes, getting engaged to do what seems urgent for today. My bigger worry is that populations over age 60 tend to be more resistant to change, less inclined to invest for the long-term future. And let's face it, people who are aged 20 to 40 are very concerned with what things will be like 30 years ahead. People who are 60 to 80 are much less concerned with what things will be like 30 years in the future. They're much more anxious about what will happen in the next 10 years. And for making the kinds of investments and changes that aging countries need to be strong in the future, I am worried that the older generation will be very resistant. I think the older generation, of which I'm now part of, tends to be more opposed to immigration, more opposed to tax increases, more opposed to investment in education. I mean, we've seen in the United States the quality of education and investment in education decline drastically as the number of people with young school-age children has fallen and fallen. Many people don't have children at all. They've been very resistant to increasing spending for education. So it will take, I think, a real campaign of education, leadership, calling on people to envisage a better future and do what's necessary. And I would say that some countries may manage to do this, others will not. The countries that figure out how to promote change and get people to invest in the future will be the strongest countries 30, 40 years from now.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not sure we differ that much in the end. It's the failure, the potential failure of aging societies to make investments, sort of necessary capacity-building investments with long-term payoffs that I think is the biggest concern. Before turning to questions from the audience, I would like to challenge my fellow panelists. Dr. Oizumi ended his presentation by saying that the outlook wasn't too rosy. I think it's probably fair to characterize the other presentations as to one degree or another less than wholeheartedly optimistic. So my challenge is for each of the panelists to say at least one optimistic thing about the future of Japan and East Asia that we have overlooked so far in our discussion. A silver lining.
Well,
I'm supposed to start? No. I'm as the moderator.
I'll start. I'm in the middle.
Okay.
I'll be
Good.
unusual and start. Look, I think the real source of optimism is that there are countries in the world that remain relatively young. Indeed, if they have a problem, it's that they have too many young people and will need help in the form of capital investment and technical guidance, help in maintaining stability in order for their young people to get the education and be as productive as they could be. That means particularly the Philippines and Indonesia, for example, which Dr. Ozumi pointed out, still have a positive demographic profile. And this is, in a sense, a real opportunity for cooperation. There are some countries that are getting rather old and facing that difficulty. There are other countries that still have a very large youth population and are facing the difficulties of how to educate them and employ them productively. So if the aging and youthful countries can work together and address their problems as a common set of opportunities, then I think we have much more potential than if the aging countries were only on their own and had to solve their problems without the opportunities provided by younger countries that are growing up nearby.
Excellent. Dr. Oizumi?
Yes. 私は悲観なことばかり言っていたように思われますが、実は高齢化というものは社会の成功の表れだと思います。まず我々、どのような価値観を持っていたとしても長く生きるというのは人生の中で最大の、いわゆる達成というふうに成功だというふうに思います。ただ高齢化が問題になるのはそれが今後も支えられるかどうか不安だからです。ですから私が言いたいのはこの不安を取り除く作業が必要であるだろうということで、その不安の作業を取り除くのは誰かとなりますと、実はそのベビーブーマーズであったり団塊の世代であったり人口の塊であったりするわけです。今1970年代に世界中で家族計画が入り人口抑制策が入ったために40代から50代に大きな人口の塊があります。でこの人たちは決して、かなりの協力を受けてきた方が多いというふうに思います。ですからその人たちがまず改革をする、自ら改革をすること、そしてもう一つ大切なのは若い世代に対しての言葉を持つこと。 今、高齢化の問題は実はその不安の2つ目は、世代間で持っているイメージがあまりにも違いすぎるということです。ですから、それは、人口の塊、ベビーブーマーズから、あるいは団塊の世代から若い世代に対して言葉を発しる。どういう社会を作りたいのか発する。で、その合意が取れた国は、非常に良い高齢社会になるんだというふうに私は思います。
鳥になってしまいましたが、難しいですね。いつも警鐘を鳴らすのに慣れてるんですが、いいことを言って終われというのはなかなか難しいものがあってですね、一つはですね、私のプレゼンテーションの2つ目のポイントにもありましたけども、若干矛盾したことを言うようですが、日米は最も老いている国と最も若い国の、これ先進国地域の中ですがこの2国間の間でのパートナーシップということです。で、私の2つ目のポイントはそれから生じる、その2つの国の間にある高齢化深度の格差が、キャパシティやウェリングネスの格差ともなって日米間の問題ともなると、リスクともなるとは指摘いたしましたが、同時にこの高齢化深度の格差を大きく残している2つの先進国がうまく戦略をすり合わせて、人、物、金、情報、それから技術、こういったものをうまく融通し合うような関係性をさらに強化していけば、先進国の間の関係性としては最もシナジーが残っている2国間というふうにも言えるわけです。で、ここをいかに、うまくこれからの時代、なるべく早くやらないと時間がないんですが、実際にこれを具体的に落としていけるかですね、戦略をすり合わせたところから具体的に落としてシナジーを享受できるかどうかというところがまだ残されている、楽観できるといいますかポイントとしてあると思います。それからもう一つは、まだ日本と北東アジアの国々との間に高齢化深度の差が残っている時期だという、この2010年代半ばにいると、この時期にこのディスカッションをしているということです。で、これが10年ほど経ちまして2020年代半ばに同じような議論をしようとしますと、日中韓と、こういった北東アジアの主要国は全て高齢化が深刻になりきった上での北東アジアの関係性というのを考えなければいけないわけですが、その時にこういった複数間のアジアの国同士の間では、先ほど申したような日米間で得られるようなシナジーというのが得られにくい状況にあるわけです。残された5年、10年、まだこの期間中であれば、日中韓の間で得られるシナジーがまだあります。で、私の理想としましては、私のベストシナリオとしましては、この10年間を日米間の関係の、体制強化ですね。それから同時に日中韓、北東アジア間でも残されたシナジーを享受するための関係性を強化して作っていこうと。他の政策分野でさまざまに行き詰まっているものが多いだけに、こういったフレッシュで新しい、それから危機感が共有しやすい課題でもって日中韓が歩み寄ることによって、そこから一つ一つ具体策に落としてシナジーを共有しようと。で、2020年代、2030年代にかけてこういった北東アジア間のシナジーが薄れていく時代に向かって、今度は北東アジアの地域として作られた枠組みをより若い国々が多くいる東南アジアに向けて拡大していくと、こういったことができればアジアでもまだ、大泉さんがおっしゃったようななかなか難しい非常に大変な状況からは少し回避する方向へ向かうんではないのかなというふうに考えている次第です。よろしいでしょうか。以上です。
Thank you. I've been shamed by my panelists' efforts here, so let me offer my quick thoughts as well. I guess I would second what both Jack and Keisuke said. I might put it in a somewhat different way, but in a word, globalization. Open global labor markets, open capital markets, given these demographic and economic growth differentials, do provide a way to match workers with job opportunities, savers with investment opportunities. Certainly from an economic perspective, there is that sort of more optimistic possibility. On the other hand, from a geopolitical perspective, differentials in economic and population growth rates can cause tensions and lead to problems. But I think there's one point, and Professor Goldstone, Jack being a fellow historian, might appreciate this, and that's that history sometimes moves in lurches. Everything we've been talking about today is a projection essentially based on current trends. But history shows that it's often just when a problem seems insoluble, where all of the forces are aligned in a way that creates stasis and gridlock and maintains the status quo, that something shifts and history lurches forward. And I think that's what I was hinting at when I talked about Japan's capacity for self-renewal and self-reinvention. Maybe we are seeing such a moment in Japan today. There are some evidence I've seen of sort of re-engagement of youth in politics. There are encouraging signs. Perhaps we're at just one of those moments in history where the challenges that seem not to have a solution all of a sudden become more tractable. So that was my attempt. Now the first question from the audience, I think Keisuke had the prescience almost to answer before it was asked. I mean, the question was, it related to, this huge generation gap between Japan and the United States, which, might make it more difficult for them to cooperate. And how can we strengthen that relationship? I think you've just addressed that. But I wanted to acknowledge the questioner. The second question directed at Jack, but I may also take a crack at this. How is China trying to deal with its aging population and the expanding gap between the poor and rich population? Are there any strategies China is taking? To what extent is it successful? Actually, Professor Oizumi may wish to add something on that as well, but the question was to Jack first.
Well, China is working very hard to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. It's directing investment to inland areas and cities. It is diverting water from water-rich areas to water-poor areas to try and sustain urbanization in the north, which otherwise would have kind of ground to a halt. China is retooling its socialist philosophy even as we speak. It's aware of the contradiction between its socialist egalitarian party ethos and the reality that capitalism in China is producing very high inequality, and so it's looking for ways to justify redistribution and efforts to spread growth around. Now, is it succeeding? In a sense, it is succeeding in that the growth rates of the inland or economically lagging areas have been pushed up, and the growth of cities in the interior, the kind of second-tier cities of 1 to 3 million inhabitants, have been growing more rapidly than the megacities of Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. But the gap is still very large. In part, this is a result of globalization and economies of scale. So that Shanghai, for example, is such a dynamic city, it tends to attract much of the best talent from around the country in China. It's the best positioned place for foreign investment. So the advantage that the advantage that a city like Shanghai has in producing high-value creative people and high-value industries is not so easily changed simply by moving investment inland. So China is making a very big effort to address the income inequality, but it's only partially successful. Now, with regard to the aging, this is a problem that, at least in China, has not yet arrived. For the last 10 years, the number of elderly has remained very small. Their big concern is dealing with the huge number of under 40 working age population that Chinese leaders want to see move from the countryside to cities, and particularly to cities in the more western and central parts of the country. The provision for the elderly population is very modest. Right now, most elderly Chinese still depend on their children for support. The state pension system is minimal. The state health system is weak. The real concern for China is that they will face an increasingly vocal demand from older people for services. Richard will tell you, he's just done a survey of people in Asia, elderly populations, where do they expect to get their support when they retire? And in China, the overwhelming proportion of the aging population expects to get more support from the state in the future. So this is a problem that for the moment the Chinese government is putting off, but is going to require their attention much more within the next 10 to 15 years.
Did you have something to add? Please, if you'd like to, Dr. Oizumi.
はい、都市化についてはもうお話ししましたし、今リチャードゴールドマン先生もお話ししたその通りです。中国だけにかかわらず、東アジア東南アジアも含めて全体を見ますと、それほど選択の余地、政策に選択の余地がないと思います。で、選択の余地がない中ですべきことっていうのは多分2つぐらいあるんだと。一つは公平と思えるような社会保障制度を国民全体に貼るということです。今中国がそれにストラグルしているわけですけれども、それは決して十分な、あるいは格差のない社会保障制度ではありません。格差はできてしまうんです。ただ国民が合意する公平な社会保障制度をどう作るかということ、それをまず中国は着手する。それが今戸籍の変えて戸籍を農村戸籍と都市戸籍をなくすというようなこと。でもう一つはもう地方で地域でどう持っていくかと。これ日本も同じですよ。地域福祉という言葉がありますが、もう消去法的にこれしかないと。世界銀行も国際機関も言っていますが、じゃあローカルでどのようにして福祉システムを作るか。これは中国でも始まってますし、タイでも始まってます。このような2つの政策が今後実施されるでしょう。そしてそれを合意するためにもう一個作らなきゃいけないのは財政改革であり徴税改革だと。で、中国は高齢化に対して都市化で対応しましたが、この2014年タイのクーデターの後、暫定政権は相続税と固定資産税を入れるということで公平さを保とうとしています。このようなことも都市あるいは富裕層と農村低所得層との間の合意がどのように図られるかということです。格差がなくなるような政策はほとんど取れないというふうに思います。しかし公平さを享受できるような政策は取れるんだ。それがどのようなものになるのかというのが治安を含めて安全保障の問題だと思います。
Let me just thank you. Let me just say that throughout China's long history, it has gone through cycles where it has swung from a period of centralization to a period of fragmentation and social chaos. And there's even a word for that chaos in Chinese. It's called luan. And the leadership in China is extremely concerned to avert and stop the next turning of the wheel. They don't want to see this next period of fragmentation occur. And actually, they are moving certainly on the aging front with remarkable speed and determination to put in place some sort of a social safety net. Just over the past couple of years, they've put in place a new pension system for migrant workers. They're running pilot projects on rural pension systems. They are aware of the problem. They are trying to do something about it, at least on the aging front. The other big issue is the huku system, right? The resident system, and the fact that you have this second class, this huge migrant population who are second class citizens and don't have access to social insurance and social services and education in the cities. And there's slower movement on that front because there's resistance from the enfranchised middle class in the cities. But there is at least some movement. The question is whether it is too little and too late. Let's completely change the topic. We have a question about the relationship between demographic change and religion. And in particular, in the future, will the Western democratic world, having Christianity at its center, will that change? I'm not quite sure I understand that part of the question. Certainly it will shrink as a share of the world total. This question's for all of the panelists. Let me start. I'd just start out by noting that there is actually a very strong correlation between degree of religious conviction and the fertility rate. And this is a correlation that runs across at least all of the major monotheisms in the world. It's true in Christianity. You take the United States, liberal Vermont at the one extreme, the state of Vermont has a fertility rate of 1.6. Conservative Utah at the other extreme has a fertility rate of 2.5. That's a difference of almost 1. You see the same, even more exaggerated spread within Judaism between secular and Orthodox Jews and within Islam as well. There was a survey done in Muslim-majority countries which asked people whether they thought that Sharia, the Islamic religious law, should be the law of the land. And the people who answered yes to that question had families that had twice as many children as the people who answered no. And so this raises an interesting question. A colleague of mine, Philip Longman, at the New America Foundation, has suggested that this fertility differential by degree of religious conviction is actually a long-term threat to progressive secular democracy. That increasingly societies will actually move in a more conservative direction because of this. I think that may be overstated, but it's interesting. Any thoughts from my colleagues?
Well, what we're seeing in much of the world is indeed that the more conservative or more, maybe not even conservative, sometimes more radical fundamental religious groups have much higher fertility. We see this in Nigeria, where the northern Muslim population has substantially higher fertility than the Christian South. We see it in Israel, where both the Palestinian population and the Orthodox Jewish population have much higher fertility than the secular and Christian Palestinian and Jewish populations. All across the Middle East, we've seen a rapid spread and growth of more radical forms of Islam. One of the things that I didn't point out, but when we talk about global demographic trends and international security that is a concern, is that aggressive militant Islamic groups have been using internet and international media to recruit, and the most rapid population growth worldwide is in predominantly Muslim countries. And indeed, if you look at the projected population of Muslims in the world, that is projected to grow by about 1 billion over the next 40 years, whereas the population of non-Muslims in Europe, North America, is liable to increase hardly at all. So if we continue to see kind of aggressive, radical, militant Islam flourish, the tilt with hundreds of millions of additional young Muslims coming into the global population in the next few decades, and hardly any increase in the NATO nations that seem to have taken on the security role of dealing with the consequences of Islamic warriors, the balance is going to tilt in a way that will be much more challenging for NATO and much more difficult for more secular governments to manage. I mean, at the moment, you pointed out the issue in China. Will there be chaos or authoritarian clampdown? I'm not so much worried about that alternative in China for the near future, but it's very evident that in the Islamic world, we're seeing on the one hand countries that slide into chaos, or countries like Egypt that are having a renewed authoritarian clampdown. So the role of religion and the impact of high fertility for more fundamentalist strains is a big problem for global security, especially, I think, for the next 30 years.
Would anybody else like to comment on Keisuke?
ドクター・ジャクソンと少し似たような話になりますけども、今アメリカは 2.1 の出生率、大対立にちょうど重なるような出生率を持っているわけですけども、で一般的には日本の方もアメリカの出生率高いんだと、で移民ファクターだねと、移民による要因だねというふうに理解されているかと思いますけども、それは半分のストーリーでしかないわけですね。でと言いますのはヒスパニック系の方々、ヒスパニックの女性が大体出生率が 3.3 人ぐらい、3人ぐらいで、黒人女性が 2.23 ぐらいで、ただ注目すべきなのは白人女性はまだ 1.8 ぐらいの子供を産んでるわけですね。で極端な話ですけど、かつてのオーストラリアのような白豪主義をもしアメリカが取っていたとしてですね、全員白人女性の国だったとして、もうそれでもまだ先進国の中で最も高い出生率に近い国としてアメリカは存在しているわけです。で問われなきゃいけないのは残り半分のストーリーで、白人女性の、出生率はなんでそんなに高いんだろうかと、高く維持されたまま、底堅いんだろうかという部分になるんだと思うんですが、経済的な要因からすると労働市場の柔軟性云々とワークライフバランスの云々という話もあるかと思いますが、これは皆さん専門家の方々も当然認識されていると思いますが、その白人女性の間での出生率の高さを維持している大きな要因の一つとしてキリスト教の宗教という役割があると思います。でキリスト教の中に説かれている、人の一生暮らしていく上での幸福とかですね、価値というものの中に家族を形成すること、それは当然子供を作るということも含めて強く示されている、説かれているわけですね。でそのことが子供を持とうというふうな判断、意思、価値、こういったところに強く影響しているんだというふうに認識しています。で翻ってじゃあ日本でどうなんだろうかということなわけですけども、今日のその日本の出生率の低さ、20代、30代、40代ぐらいの女性だけにかかわらず、男性も含めての若い世代ですけども、その世代の子供を持つ、それから家庭を形成するということに対する価値観にですね、どれほどその宗教的な影響があるのかどうか私は分かりません。分かりませんが、それが宗教に関係あるないにかかわらず、まだ経済的なファクターによって阻害されている間はよしと、これから対策の余地があるというふうに言えるかと思いますが、これがもし長年の出生率の低下の時代をあまりにも長いこと、経験しすぎているがためにですね、もう半世紀以上経つわけですね。その中で日本の若い方の間で価値観の問題として、それから人生を生きていく上での幸福感の問題として、子供はそんなに儲けなくていいんだと、 家庭というのは形成しなくても単なるオプションの一つであると、そういうふうな形で定着してしまっているのであるとすれば、それは相当に根が深い問題で、なかなか政策的にも対処しようがないというふうなことも言えるかもしれません。
Yeah, it's certainly true that when the birth rate is extremely low for a generation, 2 generations, that the small family becomes the new social norm. I believe it was Wolfgang Lutz coined the term low fertility trap to describe that. We have time for at least one, and I hope 2 more questions. We have a question from the press, and this one is an interesting question, and I read verbatim. How can we stop urbanization? I think we've given the impression that urbanization is a bad thing. So let me, specifically with reference to Japan, China, developing countries. Can we stop it? Should we stop it? The press would like to know. I think this question has your name on it, Professor. It doesn't, but I would say that it's directed at you.
都市化を進むことを止めることはできないと思います。なぜ都市化が進んでいるか、それをアジア全体で考えてもう一度考えてみる必要があるというふうに思います。で、都市化が日本においても都市化がなぜ止まらないのかというと、地方が魅力がないから。で、地方が同じようなミニ東京になっている。同じような価値観が各都市でできていって、農村から出てきた地方へ出てきた地方の都市に出てきた人は大都市に向かう。そこに価値の転換はありません。より大きな都市の方がより大きな利益が得られることは確かです。そのような構造がアジア全体で今動いているというふうに思います。ですから都市化が止めることではなくて、地方がどれだけ都市と違う魅力を持ち、それを住民が享受できるかということが大切だというふうに思います。で、都市化を止めるというのは、出生率を抑えるとか、出生率を高めるとか、そういう非常に自然の流れを変えるような動きでありまして、その都市化を止めた代償は誰が払うのかということになりますと、莫大なお金がいることになるわけです。今進んでいる都市化っていうのは自己責任で、進んでいるわけですが、都市化を止めるということになりますと、そうではないところにお金が投資がいるわけです。そのようなことが実際できるのかどうかっていうのは、何が実際起こっているのかということを都市と地方都市、そして農村で見た方がいいかというふうに思います。結論は都市化は止まらないというふうに思います。
Thank you. A final question. It's actually directed at me, but I'll give everybody a chance to answer it because I think it's a nice way to wrap up the panel. The question says, Dr. Jackson, you stated that the fact that Japan successfully reinvented itself in the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, I think this took place because of the following 2 factors. 1, foreign intervention, 2, war. I don't think and do not want, at least the latter, to unfold. What do you think about this? And here's the question. How do you think Japan will reinvent itself in the 21st century? Well, I'll very briefly, I know what has to happen. Whether it will is up to the Japanese people. We're talking about these broad and important geopolitical issues, and it seems odd perhaps to bring it back to the workplace and the family. But I really do think that the whole issue of work-family balance is at the heart of Japan's future. Japan is on a trajectory of steep demographic decline. It is in the grips of negative demographic momentum. There are some near-term policy changes which can help to keep the economy and society prosperous and moving along for another 10, 15 years. But beyond that, if this demographic decline is not reversed, it's very difficult to see how the books can be balanced, as it were. And what is required is two profound cultural transformations. If demographers know one thing, it's that you cannot bribe women to have babies. Tax breaks, cash bonuses, none of this makes any difference. Free daycare isn't going to make any difference either, except in a very marginal sense, unless these two transformations take place. One is in a workplace culture, which makes it virtually impossible for both members of a couple with children to be employed. Okay? A thoroughgoing transformation of Japanese corporate workplace culture. And the other is a transformation of family culture and a rebalancing of gender roles. And that has happened in Western countries that have high birth rates, that have managed to retain them. And in countries that haven't, there are low birth rates. And I would point out a counterintuitive fact, and that is that the correlation between female labor force participation and the fertility rate is strongly positive across the rich world today. And that's because the aspirations of women have changed. Most need to and or want to both have a family and have a job. It's the countries that enable them to do both that get more of both inputs, right? Workers and babies. Those that are less good at facilitating this dual role get less of both. So that's what the revolution, that has to be at the heart of the revolution. Whether it will happen or not is clearly not up to me.
先ほど最初に申し上げました通り、今回は企画から携わらせていただいたカンファレンスなわけですけども、こういった面々を日本に連れてきたかったですね。でこれはある意味私の意図的な黒船をという意図があるわけです。で日本は覚醒すべき時だと、いうことがあります。でぜひこの顔と名前を覚えて帰っていただいてですね、で彼らのこれまでの研究をいろいろと目を通していただきたいと思いますし、それから実は私はジャクソンの弟子ですので、もう12年ほどの付き合いになりますかね。私が大学院出てからずっと彼の下で、この高齢化、それも特にグローバルエイジングについては彼に叩き込まれたことばかりですので、彼と違うことを言うのは非常に大変でして、私も最後はこの女性の問題について、指摘して締めくくろうと思ってたんですが、言いたいことは全て言っていただいたので、そのことについては少し控えさせていただくとして、で先ほどのその戦争と、戦争が必要だったというようなことがありましたけども、かつての明治維新、それから大戦の後ですね、結局それから対外からの圧力、介入があったというこの2つの要素なんですけども、日本国民全体で、非常に明確な形で危機が共有されるということが一つ必要で、それにさらに加えて、難しい意思決定、難しいことをみんなで団結してやり遂げるためのものとして、団結が必要で、そのために海外からの介入があることによって、よし日本人みんなで今頑張ろうということができたという、そういうことなわけですね。で高齢化問題というのは非常に不幸なことに非常にスローペースで長い時間かけてまいりますし、なかなか目に見えないと。よくジャクソンも言うんですが、高齢化の変化というのは、水平線を見ていて潮の満ち引きのようなものだということで、かといって自然発生的に何十年もかけて日本が、もしくはその他追随してくる先進国が、それから新興国がこの問題に対して有効な解決策を見出してくるのを待ってるというわけにいかないんですね。 タイムリミットがあるわけです。窓が閉じてしまうわけです。2010年代、2020年代頭ぐらいまでには解決策をなんとか効果的な効率的な方法で成し遂げなければいけないわけですね。で、一つ日本で必要だなと思っておりますのは、これも私の上司だからもっとボスだからというわけではないんですが、日本でもう少しトップリーダーシップに物語を語ってもらわなきゃいけないと。ジャクソンも今では高齢化研究の政策提言、そういったシンクタンクの所長をやっておりますが、彼のアカデミックトレーニングは歴史学なわけです。彼はヒストリアンなんです、もともとは。それで非常にドライなつまらない政策の話を繰り返すシンクタンク研究員にはですね、彼の話していることに語りかけがあるわけです。ストーリーがあるわけです。でそのことというのは説得力を持ちます。でそういったものをですね、もう少し我々は日本で、トップリーダーシップに植え付けていかなきゃいけないと思うんですね。でそのことによって期間をもう少しみんなで分かりやすく、共有させていかなきゃいけないと思います。そこへ我々の中で団結を生み出していくことによって、この3度目のですね、リインベンションというのを、希望としては実現していきたいというふうに考えております。以上です。
One comment on women's rights. Do you need a war to change that situation? Fortunately, the answer is no. What we know about fertility is that if you have a situation of traditional gender roles and no opportunity for women outside the home, you have very high fertility rates. Women stay home, have lots of children. If you remove the limits on what women can do in education and in the workplace, but keep a traditional family relation in the home where men do very little and women still have all the responsibilities for child care and have a secondary achievement level imposed on them at work, then you kill fertility. You basically force women to choose between work and family. Many will choose work, family becomes a burden, and all the rich countries went through this period when fertility collapses. However, if you keep the opportunities for women to work and you change the gender balance in the family, we see an increase in fertility. People do respond to that. And it has not taken war. What it has taken in Western countries to change the gender roles and balance in the family has been the organization of women to demand their rights. It never came about because countries were worried about fertility policy. It wasn't something that leaders gave to their populations or gave to women. It's always been something that women have had to fight for and seize for themselves. So for all the women out there, I don't see as many as I'd like, but for all the women out there, raise your hands, get together, get organized, demand a change in the way family roles are set, a change in the way corporate work rules and expectations are set, because if you do not demand it for yourselves, it's not liable to come. But it is possible, and if it comes about, women will be happier, men will be happier, believe it or not. That's the experience we've had. And families will again become desirable and fertility will rise. So there's a good optimistic outcome there, but the challenge lies ahead.
Dr. Oizumi?
はい。もう先生方が女性についてはおしゃべりになられたので、私からはもうしゃべることがないのですが、高齢化の話から始まり女性の話にたどり着いたという、高齢化という問題は極めて間口が広くていろんなことを考える機会になるんだということです。政治、社会、経済はもちろんのこと、国、そして地域、最後は家庭ということにつながるわけです。我々はこの高齢化というものを実は身近なものから考えなきゃいけないということをこのシンポジウムで私は改めて痛感しました。私の自身の問題として高齢化の問題で特に自分にとって良かったことは近所のおじいちゃんおばあちゃんのことが気になるようになったと。こういう基本的なことですが、そういうことさえ高齢化という問題は我々に気づかせてくれるということです。ですから私は今日またシンポジウムに出て自分が得るものが多かったというふうに思いました。ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Well, I guess we're 10 minutes over, so we should conclude. Can we give, is it customary to applaud the panel?